Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the second part of our discussion on the origins and beginnings of the Cold War. As always, take a quick minute, jot down the rest of the outline, starting today with point number 3, and of course, pay particular attention to those key terms which will prove useful for upcoming exams or especially for essay tests. Now with that, let's begin. So we left off with really talking about the origins of why and how the Soviets began this Cold War against the United States and vice versa. And we talked about the policies of containment and, of course, the beginnings of the expansion of communism into Asia. Now, we haven't discussed it, though, is what was life like really behind Churchill's Iron Curtain. And we're going to talk for the next few minutes today about what life was like in the Soviet Union under their various leaders, from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev. And then, of course, in our next lecture, we'll discuss kind of a further long-lasting impacts of the Cold War and nationalism post-1960s. But for today, though, let's start right there, 1945, with what was Russia like under Stalin. Now, while Stalin does take over much earlier, under the Cold War era, we're talking 1945 through 1964. So through the first almost 20 years of the Cold War, Soviet Russia is being led by Joseph Stalin. And while he had promised to allow free elections and some leniency, the reality is he reinstituted a very oppressive rule in both Russia and Eastern Europe. And he does so for a number of reasons. One is this competition of struggle between the U.S. And the U.S. gives him this excuse to reinstitute a harsh dictatorship. Because after the war, he begins to repress millions of Soviet citizens living outside the Soviet borders. He wants to bring them all in and isolate them under his regime. He doesn't want any outside influence because, again, remember, part of the Cold War is ideology. There's a tremendous propaganda war between the two superpowers. As a result of this, between 1946 and 1953, the Soviet government was responsible for more than 12 million deaths of its own citizens, more than any other period of the 20th century. Most of those deaths occurring in the gulags, those forced labor camps. The other large number of them, and besides the gulags, just in general, the oppression and deaths being caused in large part due to what are called 5-year plans. Now, we discussed some of those already back in the 20s and 30s, but these continue in the 40s and 50s. And these 5-year plans, reintroduced by the USSR under Stalin, were designed to tackle the massive economic reconstruction of the post-World War II era. Remember, Russia's been largely destroyed. A lot of their industry, heavy industry, was destroyed by the Germans. They need to rebuild. And therefore, to rebuild, Stalin began to reinstitute those forced labor camps, the gulags, to help revitalize and rebuild the nation much quicker. In addition to these death camps, these forced labor camps, and all these deaths, the reality is Stalin was out to control every aspect of Soviet life. And that includes the idea of purging culture and art, especially those that came from outside of Russia. Remember, the goal here is to win the propaganda war, to convince the people that communism is the best. And so, in addition to the forced labor camps, and again, 12 million dead, he also begins purging both art and other forms of culture in order to prevent Western influence in the country. That's the Russia proper, Russia itself. What about those Eastern European, the Eastern Bloc? Again, this includes places like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. Once again, this quick list: Poland, the big buffer zone; Hungary, Czechoslovakia, we'll talk about in a minute; East Germany, of course; Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. Now, the thing is, theoretically, these nations were allowed to have their own form of government, as long as they were all one-party nations, one-party states. Then the one party, of course, was the Communist Party. And all of Eastern Europe by 1948, with one exception, Czechoslovakia, had become completely one-party states, communism, with the help of the Red Army and the KGB, Soviet Secret Police. And so Stalin was sending in the Red Army plus the KGB to all these Eastern European bloc nations in order to ensure there was only one political party. So hey, you can have free elections, that's fine, but you're going to vote for communists. So one of the big issues here becomes Czechoslovakia, because Czechoslovakia was seen as a threat to the communist state because they were the only nation doing pretty well post-World War II. They were the economic exception to Eastern Europe. They were well industrialized. They had a stable middle class. They had a stable industrial working class. And they had experience with political democracy back from the 1920s, between the 20s and 30s during the interwar period. And so Czechoslovakia was a thorn in the side because here was a nation that was succeeding without communism, even though they were technically under the communist influence. What was the result? Well, over 500,000 Czechs were purged on the behest of Stalin. Now, this is just one example, okay? I'll come back to Czechoslovakia in a second. So 500,000 Czechs are purged, as were 200,000 Hungarians arrested, 180,000 Romanians, 80,000 Albanians, all in the name of preserving communist one-party rule. Let's go back to Czechoslovakia, because while all the other Eastern Bloc nations had 5-year plans, Czechoslovakia didn't need it because they were doing well after the war. Unfortunately, though, this became problematic to Stalin. And in response to the Marshall Plan of 1947, Stalin replaced the government in 1948 to prevent Czechoslovakia from courting any outside influence from the West. So here you had a nation that was stabilized, that was economically sound, that was doing pretty well in the post-World War II period and even rebuilding. But out of fear that they would turn, well, to the West for aid and support, Stalin purged the government and instituted a one-party rule. Now, of course, in 1953, Stalin dies. And it will take a couple of years. There will be a small power vacuum. And in its wake, a couple of years later, Nikita Khrushchev will become the new leader of the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin's successor here in Khrushchev, he realized that reforms are needed. The oppressive regime of the totalitarian state under Stalin, his purges were detrimental. His 5-year plans were detrimental. And even the United States saw Khrushchev as hey, this could be a good thing. He had been seen as a moderate voice in the Stalin government. And so for a short time, there was a glimmer of hope the Cold War would end. And again, Khrushchev realized that widespread fear and hatred of Stalin's political terror resulted in the reduction of power. He realized that agriculture wasn't still in bad shape. Shortage of consumer goods was still significant. And unfortunately, the poor living conditions only declined among the working class during Stalin. And so in 1956, Khrushchev begins a process that historians call de-Stalinization. We're going to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. In 1956, Khrushchev took a startling initiative against hardliners by denouncing Stalin's crimes. Now, this was not publicly to the world. This is in a closed session to the 20th Party Congress. So only those in the building heard him do this, but Khrushchev actually lashed out and denounced Joseph Stalin. Instead, he wanted to institute what was called a Gosplan. And this is the idea of shifting resources from heavy industry and the military to consumer goods and agriculture. In other words, he realized in his mind, if you want to compete with the West, specifically the United States, you need to produce quality consumer goods that are on par with the United States. This way, there's a true war between the two nations, a Cold War of ideology and culture. And so Khrushchev sought to prove that communism was superior to capitalism. And he began wooing nations of Africa and Asia with promise that, hey, I will provide you aid and help, even if you won't turn communist. And then, of course, to the West, he said, quote unquote, we will bury you, promising that the Soviet Union and their aid and their economic system, communism, will bury and eclipse economically both the US and its allies. So on the surface, this Gosplan is actually brilliant. He realized that what Stalin was doing was not working. Focusing only on heavy industry was not working. People's lives were miserable. So he began to alter the course of the Cold War by refocusing Russia's energies not on building heavy industry and military, which they will do that as well, but on making better manufactured goods. And to win this global Cold War of ideology and supremacy, he will begin providing financial support and aid to governments, even if they will refuse to turn to communism directly. Again, this is actually a very smart strategy. Now, of course, the question is, does it work? Well, there would be a number of communist reforms. Masses would seek greater liberty and independence. And Khrushchev, for his part, was willing to allow different forms of socialism to exist, even in Eastern Europe, so long as the Communist Party remained in control. So you can say there was some definite shift here, and you can see why that the United States and its allies believed that there was some hope that the Cold War might thaw. Unfortunately, that was very short-lived, because in 1956, also, students and workers in Budapest, Hungary, began what's known as the Hungarian Uprising. And they install a liberal communist reformer as the new chief in October of 56. Hungarian nationalists stage a huge demonstration demand non-communist parties be legalized. And it turned into an armed rebellion throughout the country. The hope here was that the United States would help them, as they promised, to achieve a peaceful Hungarian independence. Unfortunately, the US declined, and Soviet tanks and troops responded instead by invading Hungary and crushing any democratic revolution. And so the result is, while there was a sliver of hope in 1956 that things might change, by October, with the Hungarian uprising that signaled to everyone in the world, Khrushchev was really not that different than Stalin was. So what about the Cold War under Khrushchev? Well, relations did improve slightly. Khrushchev sought what he called, quote unquote, peaceful coexistence with the West, so that he could focus on rebuilding the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union did agree in 1955 to a real independence for Austria. And then positive things for the Soviet Union. In 1957, they will launch Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the Earth, which signified they were actually ahead of the United States, technologically speaking, in winning what was now launched, the space race. And so effectively, with the launch of Sputnik, the Soviets were actually beating the Americans in something. In this case, this new technology that, while it was overblown in its significance, at the time was considered a big deal, because now you could spy on nations easier, theoretically. And what if you could launch a nuclear bomb into orbit from a satellite and be able to reach the destination much quicker, preventing the US from scrambling defense mechanisms? So this was a big deal initially, and it will cause both countries, both nations, to begin spending exorbitant amounts of money on who can make it to space first. Unfortunately, this is where the kind of good part under Khrushchev ends. Because by the time we get to the early 1960s, relations began to worsen once again. In 1960, there was what's called the U-2 incident. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. Khrushchev demanded that U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower apologize, which Eisenhower refused. And there was a scheduled Paris summit between Khrushchev and Eisenhower that got canceled as a result. And a longer-term impact of this U-2 incident, again, incredibly embarrassing for the United States, but a longer-term impact was when Khrushchev met with new U.S. President John F. Kennedy in 1961, he proceeded to bully and intimidate Kennedy, and the result was the start of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Because nearly 2 million East Germans had escaped from East Germany to West Germany between 1949 and 1961. Think of the incredibly bad PR this was for the Soviets. 2 million East Germans fled communist-led East Germany between 1949 and 1961 just to escape the totalitarian communism regime of, well, either both Stalin and now Khrushchev. And so the response of Khrushchev is, we're going to build a wall, because again, walls always work. And the Berlin Wall became this powerful symbol of the Cold War, literally separating East from West in a microcosm city of Berlin. It effectively created a future crisis in Berlin that we'll talk about later. And of course, the following year, 1962, in response to a failed Bay of Pigs fiasco for John F. Kennedy, Fidel Castro will, after turning Cuba communist in 1959, he will repel the U.S. CIA trained attack on the Bay of Pigs in 1961. And by 1962, Khrushchev sends in Soviet missiles into Cuba to theoretically protect Cuba from the U.S. invasion, which he had promised to do previously. He was a man of his word. Now, the problem for the United States, of course, was you're launching from 90 miles off the U.S. coast. They can hit any major U.S. city in a matter of minutes before we can scramble our defense mechanisms. Once again, it's a defense issue. And for 13 days in October of 1962, the world was on edge. And really, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, was the closest we ever got to a nuclear holocaust of World War III. Because what happens, the U.S. placed a naval blockade in the water off the coast of Cuba, and for 13 days, the world watched as essentially they watched a radar blip on their screen as Soviet ships became closer and closer and closer to that naval blockade of the United States. And everyone knew if those ships crossed that line, this line in the water, World War III was on. Now, thankfully for the world, cooler heads prevailed. And the last minute, Khrushchev will agree to withdraw the missiles if the U.S. A, promises never to invade Cuba again, and B, agrees to withdraw missiles from Turkey. Now, officially, the United States only agreed to not invade Cuba, but unofficially, they would also remove their missile silos from Turkey. So, in theory, it was a win for Khrushchev, but because only officially they got the promise not to invade Cuba, in the minds of many Soviets, in the minds of many world leaders, Khrushchev was extremely weakened by this. And as a result, it will contribute to his downfall just a couple years later, 1964. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, yes, did. And the second big issue that caused his downfall was in 1963, the U.S., the USSR, and the Soviet Union, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, signed a historic treaty that would ban atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, called the Nuclear Test Ban. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now, this was an attempt to reduce Cold War tensions, which theoretically it did. Side note, France refused to sign this treaty because they were in the process of secretly developing their own weapon. And then China became a nuclear power in 1964, the following year, learning that will actually lead to its estrangement and fallout of relations between the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, was this a big deal? Yes. Because whereas the first few years of the 1960s was on the brink of World War III, the signing of the nuclear test ban did cool down this escalation that had been building for the last 5 years. On the other side, for the Soviets, though, this was seen as a failure. Because in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was seen as a failure of Khrushchev. Signing a peace treaty to ban nuclear testing was also seen as a sign of weakness for the Soviets. In 1964, between those two events and the expensive cost of their Soviet space program, which people really weren't sure if would prove dividends, other than for pride and prestige, led to the expulsion of Khrushchev. And in 1964, we will have a new leader, Leonid Brezhnev. And he will come to power in 1964. He will last all the way until 1982 officially. Now, under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union, beginning in 1964, will enter in a period of stagnation and limited re-Stalinization. In other words, things get bad again. For the first few years, there will be a massive arms buildup under Brezhnev in response to the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, once again, though, the Soviets will avoid direct confrontation with the US, and which ironically means that they seemed a little more committed to peaceful coexistence than Khrushchev had been, even though Khrushchev's the one who said he wanted that. And so, on the surface, it appeared that things would get worse again because they're rebuilding the military. But the reality is Brezhnev did want to exist pretty peacefully. Now, on the other hand, Brezhnev would also issue what's known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. It was issued in order to say, hey, the Soviet Union and its allies have the right to intervene in any socialist country whenever they saw the need. Now, you can imagine this is a pretty broad declaration. You also recognize that it has tremendous ties back to like the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary in U.S. history. And for a short time again, in the late 60s, this began to ramp up the Cold War once again. Not to mention, this is also the era of Vietnam. So things are pretty hot throughout the world, in large part thanks to the Brezhnev Doctrine and, of course, the Vietnam War going on throughout much of the late 60s. The one thing that begins to change, though, in 1968, the U.S. elects Richard Nixon to be the new president. And President Richard Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, they tried to figure out a way to ease tensions. Now, they had their own issues with Vietnam. That's a whole separate issue back from U.S. history we talked about last year. But when it came to his foreign policy outside of Vietnam, both sides sought a new path. And for Nixon, he was trying to use that old idea of realpolitik. And so Nixon and Kissinger believed the U.S. should pursue policies and make alliances based on national interests rather than just an ideological worldview. Let me repeat that. Realpolitik. Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, believed the United States should pursue policies and make alliances based on national interests, both political and economic, rather than on ideological worldviews. In other words, maybe it's okay to trade with a communist nation if it's in the larger benefit to the United States and not be such a hardline anti-communist. Not that they liked communism at all, but that if it's better in our interest to support it, then hey, why not? This is, again, practical political means, realpolitik. And so in this case, they sought to play the Soviets and the Chinese off each other. Because after the Chinese developed the nuclear bomb, relations were extremely strained between these two large communist nations. And so in 1972, Nixon visits China. The Soviets were concerned by that point that maybe the Chinese and the US were drawing too close to each other. But then the world was shocked as later in 1972, Nixon also went to Moscow, becoming the first president in decades to go to Moscow. And it ushers in a new era known as détente. This peaceful relations, political negotiations between the two superpowers. And for a good 6, 7, 8 years, things finally cooled down a little bit. Instead, what became about was that Brezhnev and Nixon sought to establish rules that would govern the rivalry between the US, the USSR, and China. In other words, all three are still superpowers. All three are still competitors. All three still don't like each other. But maybe we can create some rules to govern this competition to avoid a nuclear holocaust. The result? 1972, Brezhnev and Nixon signed what was known as the SALT I Treaty. It's SALT-1 Treaty. And they signed this treaty to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles and to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles to only 200 for each superpower. Now, was this a big deal? Symbolically, it was huge. You have for the first real time this massive arms reduction between these two superpowers. And again, this new era of détente. Now, on the other standpoint, it wasn't that big of a deal in the sense that right after it signed, the development of the MIRV missiles, the MIRV missiles, that could carry multiple warheads on a single missile, pretty much made the SALT Treaty obsolete. But it was a start. And then 3 years later, there would be what's called the Helsinki Conference. And this is, ironically, the Helsinki Conference of 1975 was actually officially ended World War II. Big surprise there, right? It finally legitimized the Soviet-dictated boundaries of Poland and other Eastern European bloc nations. In return, though, for their newfound borders, the Soviets guaranteed a more liberal exchange of people and information between East and West, and the protection of basic human rights. So all those things that Stalin supposedly agreed to FDR back in 1945, now were actually finally granted in 1975, some 30 years later. Again, this is détente at work. Unfortunately, reality was Moscow kept squashing basic human rights, but this was a small, tiny step in this process of détente. Now, unfortunately, détente is going to end by the end of the decade, because by the end of the decade, the Soviets are going to do an invasion of Afghanistan, which is going to have tremendous fallout. Now, of course, they need oil. They need to get to Afghanistan. They want to expand communism. Now, this is going to be a big problem for a number of reasons. Number one is the US will refuse to ratify SALT II Treaty that would reduce nuclear armaments. It will also lead President Jimmy Carter to have the US boycott the 1980 US Olympic Games that were held in Moscow. This will also result in the Soviets they will boycott the 1984 Olympic Games held in Los Angeles, California. The US will also stop shipments of grain and certain technology to the Soviet Union. So again, all those things that have been resolved in the Helsinki Conference have been thrown out the window now. And unfortunately, though, this begins to kind of divide the world a little bit, because most of the Allied powers, France, Italy, West Germany, argue that, yeah, this was bad, they should not have invaded Afghanistan, but to cut off trade and relations again would likely lead to World War III. And so therefore, only Britain actually decided to back the US sanctions against the Soviets after their invasion of Afghanistan. So the Helsinki Conference and the invasion of Afghanistan really began to turn the world once again, the Cold War. And they lead to a much colder place. That's only going to get worse in 1980 when the US elects Ronald Reagan to be president, and he begins to ramp up the Cold War by name calling and calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. Now, that's it for this time. Now, we'll talk about the implications of the Afghan war. It's been one of the major downfalls of the Soviet Union that will lead to their ultimate demise. We will talk about the rise of Reagan. And we'll also talk about the other issues of nationalism in our next lecture. But for now, take care, and until next time, bye-bye.